Okay, everybody, good evening. I'd like to thank you all for making the first of three panel discussions here with Mr. Garry Kitchen, Mr. David Crane, and Mr. Dan Kitchen. Tonight's discussion is called the Atari and the Activision Years. And then tomorrow at 4 o'clock, we're going to have a discussion around Absolute Entertainment and these gentlemen's involvement there. And then on Sunday morning at 11:30, we're going to be talking about their work with Audacity Games and bringing new games to the Atari 2600 platform. So again, this is number one of three. It's going to tell a complete story by Sunday. So I hope you all can make it back and hear what everybody has to say about the Absolute Years in Audacity Games as well. Real quick, my name is Whitney Roberts. I'm the co-host of the Broken Token Classic Gaming Podcast. And with me here tonight, and gentlemen, would you mind you need no introduction, but still we have to have an introduction.
Garry Kitchen.
David Crane.
So guys, there you go. Excellent. Right up there in the mic. So gentlemen, tonight's discussion is around really the formation of your time that led into creating Activision and your time working with, dealing with, creating games on the Atari 2600 console for Atari itself. And would you all, I guess probably the best way to start this is, would you all mind to, I guess, kind of give the audience and give us just a quick idea as to how did you get started creating games for the 2600? What led you to Atari to making the games? And of course, we'll get into Activision here in just a few minutes. But where did it all start for the three of you?
I grew up being an artist, drawing, painting. That's really where my passion was all the way through high school. And then when I went to college, I went for art. Seemed logical, except I started to wonder about whether or not I was going to be able to pay the mortgage with that, but it was what I loved to do. And I ended up getting a job offer at a tiny little engineering company, tiny, like 4 people. And they were doing things with electronics, and I knew nothing about that. But they offered me a job as the low man on the totem pole, going out and, getting lunch and making sure there was plenty of Coke in the fridge and M&Ms. So they started doing some fun stuff with electronics. I started learning on the job, and I changed to night school in college and changed from art to engineering, electrical engineering. That was a great discussion with the college guidance counselor, who said, no one does that. You don't go from art to engineering. But what did I know? So I did that, got into engineering, started working at this little company, learned a lot, and started first in electronic toys. Did a couple of 4-bit microprocessor-based electronic toys. Right after the time when Mattel came out with Mattel Football, which was everybody who was born in that era knew about. Mattel Football was really the first electronic toy. It had little red lines and the ball went down the field. And after that, I did a couple of games, ended up being marketed by Parker Brothers. Wildfire was a pinball machine. Bank Shot was a simulation of billiards. And then I saw what was going on the West Coast. Atari had started, and they had just released this cartridge-based machine, and this company, Activision, had spun out of Atari and started to do really amazing video games. I saw the end was coming, that was going to take away from the electronic toy business. So I went out and I bought an Atari, and back then, you didn't call Atari and say, send me a manual, I want to write games. Everything was top secret, closed system. There were no manuals. There was no way to learn how to do an Atari. So I bought it, ripped it open, reverse engineered it, figured out how it worked, figured out how to write games on it. And I called this guy who had founded Activision, the company I admired so much from the East Coast. And that's how I got into Atari. And then we'll go to Dave. Or maybe go to Dan, because Dan was with me, and then go to Dave, because Dave's kind of the centerpiece.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And Dave, we certainly after Dan, Dave, we certainly want to hear about how you got started at Atari and then springboarded onto Activision. But yeah, Dan, certainly hear
East Coast, West Coast parallel
there you
story.
Go. Yeah,
we were East Coast at that point, me and Dan.
I had kind of followed Garry and became a technician for this small company. So when they created circuits or electronic games, they needed to have these prototyped. So I would be the guy in the back with the soldering iron and the chips and wired everything up. And eventually through that company, I learned to program 4-bit microprocessors. And then for Christmas 1980, I received an Apple II computer. And Garry was already playing around with that. And I learned that at night and taught myself programming. And eventually, Garry and I left that small company and started our own company in his basement, writing software for the Apple II computer. And just about that time, Garry had just finished his first Atari game, which was called Space Jockey. And I think I'll let Dave pick it up from here, and then we'll kind of go into how we joined Activision. But we'll let Dave go back to the beginning of Activision.
Sure. Well, unlike Garry, I was an engineer from the day I was born. I'd take things apart, fix them. I designed a tic-tac-toe playing computer when I was 12 years old. It didn't use a computer, it actually used switches. And I was the kid in the neighborhood who would understand how games worked. If we had a board game that required 4 players, and I only had 2 friends over, they'd hand me the box. It was printed on the underside of the lid of a game box with the instructions. And they would just basically say, all right, how do we change these instructions so it works for 3 people instead of 4? So I'm basically writing game logic back then. So that was, in my grade school years. But there was no doubt I was going to become an engineer. My dream was to make a product that would be sold on late night television, where I'd make one of them and I'd sell 1 million of them. Ron Popeil was my idol. He was the guy who made the Vegematic.
Yeah.
Right, the Ginsu knives.
Ginsu knives, whatever. Make one. But my mother was an artist, and she insisted that all of her children take watercolor classes and learn how to paint and do art. And so I learned all of that from that standpoint. But again, if I did a painting, it took 3 or 4 hours to do a painting. And if I wanted to do a second painting, it would take 3 or 4 hours again. So no. I want to do this thing once and mass produce it and sell 1 million of them. And so I actually, in college, I invented another tic-tac-toe playing computer for one. There were a lot of power outages back then, so I designed a digital clock that automatically set itself by using communication over the power line. A programmable rhythm section, those drum machines back then, they weren't programmable. You would just, select the tango or whatever, and you'd get that. I made one that was programmable. I did all that kind of stuff. So it was clear that was the direction I was going. I was also a tournament tennis player, and that came into play because when I moved to Silicon Valley, I took an apartment in a complex that had tennis courts. And Alan Miller, who was one of my co-founders at Activision, but working at Atari at the time, he and I played tennis and we hung out. And one night he came up, and after we played tennis, he pulled out an ad that he had written for Atari to get new game programmers, because they had just put out their Atari 2600, and asked me to proofread it because he was going to put it in the newspaper the next day. And when I read it, I said, sounds like kind of interesting job. I'm not sure I really want to program in a microprocessor for a living. I was working at National Semiconductor doing engineering, which is much better, right? So anyway, but I said, yeah, this is kind of interesting. And that night, I went back to my office at National Semiconductor, and on an 8-bit computer that I had written a word processing program for, I wrote up a resume, arranged with Al that I would meet at 10 o'clock the next morning, and received an offer by 2 o'clock that afternoon. So in less than 24 hours, I said, okay, I guess I'm going to be making games at Atari. And that was when Atari was still fun. So that got me to Atari.
Yeah, that's amazing. That stuff just doesn't seem to happen like that now. So it's just crazy to think about how something so pivotal to history happens so quickly like that. So David, your time at Atari, can you talk to us a little bit about the games that you did there, and then what really led to creating of Activision, and then what brought you and Dan and Garry together?
Yeah, I mean, Atari was a little company very much doing innovative things. We were at the forefront of video games. This was new. Video games just weren't out at the time. And Nolan Bushnell was very much hands-on. He would come down to the lab and we would talk about game ideas and whatever. But he had just sold the company to Warner Communications, and he needed money to expand Atari, so he got the big corporate parent. And they never understood the creativity of making video games, and this became a big issue that has always been a problem in the video game business. Is there's the creators, and then there's the money people and the marketing people, and they don't understand each other. So it was a fun place.
Yeah, that hasn't changed.
Yeah. It was a fun place to work. You'll hear a lot of stories about drug use and naked hot tub parties in the office.
No.
I did not experience any of those things. I had a group of people I worked with. We were very self-motivated, very technically oriented, and somewhat interestingly, both left and right brain people. To make a video game at that time was very, very technical. I could astound you with some of the strange things we had to do to make the system do something interesting technically. But it was also very creative and artistic and had to look nice. So you had to have both the technical and the creative skills to do this, because at the time, the game team for making a game was one person. And I usually say one man, and until Carol Shaw came along, it was one man, but we brought in Carol, and she did really well. So yeah, it was every day you'd be working with people that are very competent at all of these skills, making a game, working on it until we like it. You know, it would be iterative process. I would do something, and I said, that's not fun. So I'd write it again, and I'd write it again, and finally it starts to feel fun. And you know, for example, I've got a guy on the screen and I want to move it to the right. So I move the joystick to the right and the guy moves to the left. Well, that's a bug. So you go back and you fix the code. Now you go back and you touch it and again. So over and over and over, just every couple minutes you write a new section of code, test it, see how it works, and always try to end up with your vision at the end that you've got a fun game that everybody can play.
So through all of that, in that work, would Atari dictate to you what titles to work on, what games that you got to develop for? Would they take your suggestions, your ideas? How did that play out?
Yeah, you're asking all kinds of funny questions when it comes to Atari. Doesn't a lot of that depend on whether it was Atari pre-Warner or Atari post-Warner?
Yeah.
No, it's all of my time at Atari. It was all post-Warner, but just barely. But it was before it really started to fall apart. But it was truly a strange environment. They had a computer system that emulated or simulated the Atari 2600. Simple as that. You sit at a terminal and you type code and you would upload it into a system that's plugged into the Atari 2600, so you could write a game and see it work on a real TV set. You know, it was just a one-to-one thing. And they'd sit you down and say, here's a 30-page manual of how the hardware works inside the Atari 2600. Now go make a game. That was the direction that we got.
Wow.
From absolutes, the day I walked in. That's
not even fair.
Yeah, from the day I walked in, they said, see what you can do.
Training.
I want to see a game.
What training?
What training, yeah.
So that they did have a list of games that people had thought of and not done.
Okay.
So they did have this list. If you can't think of anything, here's a list that, brainstorming results from, we've talked about. And you kind of looked at each other and said, oh, so those are games I'm not going to do.
Yeah.
Because
those are the bad ideas.
Those are the bad ideas.
Somebody else already turned this down, right?
Yeah.
So they were trying to help, but they were actually working against themselves in that respect. And so, well, it was a real crucible. I mean, you're thrown into the fire and say, do something, and if you don't, you're a failure. And I ended up kind of gravitating with 3 other guys, and the 4 of us made most of Atari's most successful games, and went to lunch together and that sort of thing. And so when it really started to hit the fan at Atari, we ended up, the guys sitting around saying, this is terrible, what are we going to do?
So out of that, then soon comes the idea for Activision. And when you decide to leave Atari, David, and you say, okay, I'm going to now build a life, I'm going to build a career on what I've learned here and then carry it forward. What was the pressure like for that? Because there are so many uncertainties, so many unknowns. Were you concerned about legal action from Atari? Were you concerned about retribution from others within the industry? I mean, today it seems like we're in such a litigious environment. Yes, exactly. So how did that play out back then? I mean, could you just go and start a company that way?
Well, yes and no. The first question that you asked was the risk, or how risky was it?
Yeah.
Well, we were all young kids living in apartments. None of us had spouses. None of us had mortgages. So we really didn't have that kind of worry. There wasn't any financial worry.
We knew what we could
do.
Yeah.
To give you an idea, Atari's marketing department, the year right before we left, when we were thinking about leaving Atari, they brought out this memo, okay? And the memo was the top 20 selling games in Atari's catalog for the previous year. Okay. And what they were really asking us to do is, you see these games that sold millions and these that sold thousands? Do more like these. I'm serious. They were just saying, do more games that sell millions.
So that's the direction.
That's the direction we were getting from
just do more that's good.
Department.
Wow.
But it gave us a different message. So we looked at this list, and of these 20, said, well, wait a minute. Larry did that one and that one and that one, and Bob did that one and that one and that one. Al did that one, and I did this one, this one, and this one. We had done 60% of Atari's sales for the previous year, the 4 of us.
Okay.
And it was an open secret that Atari had sold $100 million worth of cartridges.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
$100 million worth of cartridges.
That's the inflection point.
And the 4 of us had done $60 million worth of sales, and we were all making $20,000 a year.
That's not right.
Yep.
That's not right.
So we went to Atari management, and we pointed this fact out. And the new CEO at that time, Nolan, had been booted out by then. I was at Atari for about 2 years, and so this is the end of it. And the new CEO there said, he was from corporate business. He worked for Burlington Industries making fabrics. And they decided that's who should run Atari, the creative video game company, right? And he said, no. You didn't make those games. Atari made those games. There's all the people in the marketing department doing the boxes and writing the manuals, and the guys on the assembly line who have to put them together. Atari made those games, not you guys. This is sort of a Jedi thing, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so we walked out of that meeting, and the senior vice president, who knew better, as he was walking us out, he shook our hands and said, "It's been nice knowing you guys."
Oh, so at that point, he already knew what was going to happen.
He knew the writing was on the wall.
Yeah.
And so we were leaving regardless. And we actually thought about leaving, forming a company, and just consulting back to Atari and letting them publish the games, because we would then get a bigger percentage and we would get a royalty, which Atari would not even talk royalty. They absolutely refused to even use the word. But Al Miller was actually the driving force. He said, no, let's just compete with Atari. Let's make our own publishing company. We talked to a lawyer. The lawyer put us on to a business guy who was Jim Levy, who ended up our CEO, founding CEO. He had been talking to venture capital at Sutter Hill Ventures, and they were ready to write a check. Mm-hmm. So we all came together in just like a 2-month period and got funded. We were the first software company funded by a venture capital company. They had always funded companies that made widgets and gadgets and things they could hold in their hands.
Right.
and ended up doing our first 4 games in the first 4 months from the day we opened.
Okay. So after those first 4 months and those first 4 games, how would you determine what the game roster for upcoming titles would look like? And then what led to the East Coast, I guess, design studio with Garry and with Dan? Because growth is always a target. There's no doubt about it. You have to grow, but can you give us some insight into what the very early days were like, and then what led to that desire or that branching out?
Yeah, it's a big deal. We had 4 programmers, and we hired a friend of mine that I had gone to college with, and he was also in Silicon Valley, and so we ended up with 5.
Okay.
And
was that Steve Cartwright?
That was Steve Cartwright.
That was key. Okay, just want to make sure.
Activision games were really good games. All right, we were really good at what we did. Everybody loved them. They played really well.
Amen to that.
A lot of the reason for that was because we had a synergy as a group. And it was really one man responsible for each game, but the entire group kibitzed. They would stand, we were in a bullpen with cubicles. Everybody could see everybody else's screen. And somebody would come by and say, that sucks. They would just flat out tell me that didn't look good, right? And I'd argue with them, and then I'd fix it, right? So the games were the product of a group of people working together. And we learned very quickly that 4 or 5 people could do that. You try to put 20 people in the same lab, and it wouldn't work at all. And in fact, there was a Harvard Business School case study on what we called the design center concept, which is get 5 or 6 people, 4 or 5 or 6 people who worked together really well, had a good group synergy, put them in an office so that they shared the space and had to work together, and we would be able to expand. So now, how do we expand? Well, we need to find these groups that have a group of people who work together well that we can just set up in an office and have them churn out games. That was the design center concept.
Okay.
And it was truly intentional that we were going to make this is how we were going to grow Activision.
Okay. So I take it that from there, that's Garry.
Let's take it from there and let Garry take over the mic.
So after I reverse engineered the Atari, I did this first game, Space Jockey, for the gentleman that Dan and I worked for this small company. And we were in a similar situation to Dave. When I finished that game, I figured guy would take it and sell it to Atari or to Activision or make a boatload of money for the company. And it kind of disappeared, and he went off and started another business called US Games. Didn't tell me about it. I was the only guy in the business who knew the Atari, and started it with someone else and put the game out. And I went to him and said, I should have been involved in that. And I make $11,000 a year, and I put you in the Atari business. Maybe I should get a raise. And he said, no, you're not worth more than that. So that was it.
It's brutal.
Out the door. See you later.
Yeah.
Dan went with me. And pretty soon after that, my phone rang because people who knew how to program the Atari who didn't work at Activision or Atari numbered 1. I was the only one who knew the Atari at the time because I didn't work at Atari, I didn't work at Activision, and I had reverse engineered it. So I got a call from Coleco, and Coleco said, we just bought the rights to Donkey Kong on the Atari, and we need someone to program it. Sure, I could do that. So I took that project from them, and in the process of doing it, which was really hard to do, you're taking a $3,000 machine, a game with unlimited ROM, unlimited RAM and power, and putting it into a $6 cartridge. That's a whole other story we'll get to in the next episode.
Sure.
But in the meantime, I started thinking about what we were going to do next. So I picked up the phone and I called Activision's main number because we really liked the Activision games. And we said, like do games to them. So I called, I got the receptionist, I asked for the head of product development, bounced around the switchboard a little bit, finally got to a guy named Tom Lopez. And I said, hi, my name's Garry Kitchen. I'm in the New York area. I know you guys are California, but I program Atari 2600 games. And he said, no, you don't. I said, the only people who do that are the people at Atari and the people in my office. I said, well, I'm just finishing Donkey Kong for Coleco. And he said, I'll be there tomorrow. I had the right words. So he came out, met with him, and also talked to Atari. And then Atari started courting Dan and I and our team. We had 4 or 5 people, and as did Activision. Both of them flew us out to California first class when they figured out we knew how to program the Atari.
Yeah.
By then, I had spread the knowledge to the other guys, and we were all working on Atari games. So we went out, met with these guys, met with Atari's people, and then made a decision to go with Activision. Not necessarily because they were offering us more money. They actually weren't. It was because we respected the games, and the games were great, and we wanted to do games of that quality. So they, on the other side of the country, recognized there's another design center, and you know what? They're 3,000 miles away, and if they screw up royally, they won't affect our chemistry.
Well, more important, they're not going to be in the office with us screwing up the 5 or 6, the group synergy. They got their own group.
So we opened the Eastern Design Center in Glen Rock, New Jersey in 1982. And we were the satellite office
Before you
of
did that,
Activision.
you did get an offer from Atari.
We did. Yeah. We got a big offer from Atari. They really badly wanted us.
After you let them know that you've decided to go to Activision.
Yeah, I said, we're not going to do it. We're going to go to Activision. And I talked to Steve Mayer. Steve Mayer, one of the big guys at Atari. And he said, I'm coming to New York tomorrow. So he flew out, pulled up at my front door of my little teeny tiny house in New Jersey with a limo. Get in. And we drove into New York City, and we went to the Time Warner building. And I'm just this kid. I don't know anything from anything. I'm a kid. I just want to work with Activision to make great games. So we go into the Time Warner building, takes me up to the top floor, and we go into this office that's bigger than this room, and Manny Gerard, who was one of the senior VPs at Time Warner, they had divisions, and he ran the video game division. So the guy, the Burlington Coat Factory guy, it wasn't actually Burlington Coat Factory, Burlington Industries guy reported to Manny Gerard, who was the head Warner guy. So he drags me into Manny Gerard's office, and I'm like, what the hell's going on here? Sits me down and says, Manny goes, what'll it take? I got a blank check. What'll it take?
Dangerous words.
I know.
Yeah.
And I came up with even more dangerous words. Being the idiot that I was at the time, probably worked out okay in the end, though. I sitting there saying to myself, God, but we just like those Activision guys. We like those games. I know you're offering a lot of money. And I said, look, I'll be honest with you, Manny. They had just come out with the Pac-Man cartridge for the Atari. And, all due respect,
we know how that landed.
It wasn't the best game ever done on the Atari.
Yeah.
So I looked at Steve Mayer and I looked at Manny and I said, I got to be honest with you, Manny, I can't work for a company that put out a piece of shit like that.
Wow.
And next thing I knew, I was in New Jersey.
That's strong.
I got whisked out of that building.
Via a yellow cab.
Yeah, yellow cab on the ride.
1,000 miles an hour back to New Jersey. And we joined Activision.
Now, in fairness, Atari threw a lot of money at you, but you got stock with Activision.
Yes, we got stock with Activision. 2 weeks after we joined the company, they called us up and said, well, we hope you don't have any plans first week of July. And I said, why? I said, because we're taking the entire company to Hawaii because we had a good year last year. You, your family, first class, 3 days in Kapalua Bay, Maui.
Bay Resort.
So I hung up the phone and said, all right, I didn't make a bad decision.
250 people we flew.
Wow. 250 people.
Yeah, it was all the employees plus a significant other. So
okay.
We had about 120 at the time.
Yeah.
And that's when we met David Crane. And Dave and I have worked together continuously since 1982 when we joined Activision, except for a 2-year period where he worked went off and did work with Hasbro on a very interesting project. Other than that, though, we've worked continuously the entire time, and obviously most of the time with Dan as well.
Yeah. So Dan, just out of curiosity, I mean, how does your story parallel with Gary's as far as rolling into Activision and that from that perspective?
Yet, what was the reaction in the office when you learned that Gary turned Atari down?
Well, we had gone out to Atari together and had a tour of the lab and met some of the guys. And then I remember sitting with one of the executives and during the conversation made some comment like, you guys are designers, I can get towel designers to do what you do. And we immediately knew that it was not a creative atmosphere.
Yeah.
But Gary failed to tell the story that, so we had left this little company and gone to his basement and started to write Apple games while Gary had already learned the 2600. And we bought Activision games because we loved Activision games. And we always, the new Activision game coming out, we'd always go to the store and get the next one. And Activision, unlike Atari, promoted the designers. So in the back of every manual, there's a picture of David Crane with his autograph, a little spiel about the game.
Oh, yes.
And so we got to know these guys through their games. Hey, that's a Bob Whitehead game, skiing. Hey, that's a David Crane game, fishing derby. Hey, that's Larry Miller, he did Kaboom. And so we started following these guys and started talking when Gary was reaching out to Activision, started talking about, boy, wouldn't it be great to work with them? So there were primarily 4 of us in this little company. And I remember at one point, Gary took out one of the manuals or one of the catalogs, and it had the 4 pictures of the 4 Activision founders, and he put little pieces of paper over each one, and he drew our faces and said, one of these days we're going to work with them, and stuck it up on one of the boards in Gary's basement.
That's powerful.
And so that led serendipitously to us working for Activision. And the first time we went out to Activision, we were there when these guys were just coming back from lunch, but we were sitting out in the parking lot, and we were like fanboys. Oh my God, there's David Crane. Oh, that's Bob Whitehead. I recognize him from the picture. Oh my God.
Hey, Dan, I think you should tell your story, though, about the interview in Activision's office.
So we were fanboys. We went in, we met these guys. They were superstars to us. And so during the interview process at Activision, Al Miller had just created a game called ice hockey. Well, I had gotten pretty proficient at ice hockey.
And ice hockey was only a 2-player game, head-to-head.
Only a 2-player game. And Gary, you can tell the story from here.
No, you tell it.
During the interview, Gary had mentioned, while we were sitting in the conference room with Atari on the table with a TV, Gary said to Al Miller, he said, Dan plays ice hockey. He's pretty good at it. And I think Al slid over an Atari joystick and said, why don't we try?
All right.
Yeah?
I see where
He goes, do you want to play?
this is going.
And I said, no, between the 2 of us, Dan is the better game player. I said, Dan is tremendous at ice hockey. And Al's like,
so Al puts it in, and we're all sitting in the conference room, and I start playing Al, and I had this one move where I could go behind the net and kind of drop the puck in. And I did that, and Al looked at me and said, how'd you do that? And so I kind of showed him what I did. I ended up beating him at ice hockey at his own game in the conference room during the interview.
And then we were hired.
Okay, he's hired.
That was it. You beat the designer in his own game, you're hired.
As an aside, when you make a game, you play test it as you're developing. And sometimes the guys in the lab would come over and try it out, but you were the one who spent most of the time. So there is a period in the life of that game where it's finished and the game designer is the world record holder. Right?
Technically, that's true.
Technically, that's true.
For about 8 seconds.
But technically, it's true.
A week after it released, there's 1 million kids who have better scores than we could ever create. We learned that very quickly, that there's other ways to play the game. Billy Mitchell's one of those kids who would go out there and make our games all, blow away our scores.
So as Gary mentioned, we opened the Eastern Design Center, and we were just tickled pink to be working with these guys. And Gary, you can pick up from here, from
those
where we
were the
started
days,
from there.
Where am I picking up from the design center?
I think you're one of your first games, and how we worked closely with Dave Crane.
Yeah.
And
So I started working on a game. A lot of pressure. Okay, we made this deal with us, and we're paying you this money to make a game. And I had just come off Donkey Kong, So I was in the mood to make another little man game. That's what I call them, little man games. So I had a little guy running around, and a big driving force on what concept you came up with on the Atari 2600. People don't know this, but there's a process to the creative process. And what it is you only come up with a game where if you can put something on the screen that's recognizable. Like, I would have never done Adventure because the dragon looked like a duck. I wouldn't have done it. I would have said, well, I can't make a dragon that looks good. I'm not doing it. So I tried a bunch of little men out, and I had to have a little man that you would look at and go, oh, I know what that is. And we would actually test. I'd call Dave over or Dan over and say, do you know what this is? And they go, I don't know. Is that a photographic camera? Nope, it's not.
If you have to explain it, it's
if you have to explain it, it's not. So the one that I finally came up with is I put a bowler cap on a guy, and I said, oh, it's a Keystone Cop. Now that's a guy that he's carrying a billy club. He's got that old Keystone Cop hat on, and that's where I decided to do Keystone Capers. And when I first did it, it was a vertical game. He was running up the outside of the building, and a thief had stolen stuff in the building, and he was throwing items down on the cop that he had stolen. And Dave came out, and Dave at that point had just finished Pitfall, but it hasn't shipped yet. And he showed us Pitfall, and we were obviously oohing and eyeing. Mm-hmm. And he and I brainstormed, and he said, you could try screen-to-screen vertical. I mean, horizontal on Keystone Capers rather than vertical. Maybe it would work better. So I switched it to screen-to-screen, and Keystone Capers was born rather than the vertical that I had. And the other thing about making a game is I would make a game on an Atari if I had some hook of something that looked really good. And the hook was I made an escalator. I thought it would be really cool to make an escalator where the stairs moved perfectly smooth, and if the character jumped, he always landed on the step perfectly. Mm-hmm. Like there was no pop. He's like on this, it's perfect. The physics are perfect. And I did that. Once I did that, I said, now I got to make a game with an escalator.
And now it has to be in an apartment
so it had to be in a multi-level store. David said, let's go horizontal. So everything added up, and that was Keystone Capers.
So through that time, you're developing Keystone Capers. Dan, you're working with your brother on the East Coast. David, you and 4 other star developers for Activision are out on the West Coast. How did you all share code? How did you all develop? How did you create the Activision look and feel that we all know of when you were on opposite sides of the country? Because one thing that, and I'll say this, I'm not sure about the rest of the audience, but Dan, to your point, I was a fanboy as well. And every game that I ever bought for the Atari 2600, I judged by Activision games. They were always the first that I would buy. I would always read the back of the box. Dave, I remember seeing your face on Pitfall, your face on your other games, Gary, your face on Keystone Capers. I mean, Activision was more than a game publisher. It was a company that said quality, and the look and the feel, the art direction. It was more than the sum of its parts.
And actually, that brings up a story about that exact thing.
Okay, so I would love to know, and I think it's really interesting to hear how you all kept the zeitgeist together, and then how you developed that branding.
Well, when Dan and I, before we knew Activision, I was reverse engineering the Atari. I don't think we had ever seen an Activision game, but I knew that the Atari was going to be big. That's why I was reverse engineering it. And I had heard this company on the West Coast had started. So I go into a store, and there's an Activision game. And first of all, I was just stunned that someone would have the nerve to put a game out that wasn't out by Atari. It's like, who?
Atari was a big name.
Who would do that?
It was huge.
Who would do that?
Yeah.
So I called Dan up when I got home because I bought it. It was skiing. I bought it and I said, Dan, and I was crying. I was laughing so hard. I said, this company put out games for the Atari, and they're not Atari. I can't wait to see what a piece of junk this thing is. I mean, and Dan hops in his car, runs over. We're ready to just throw tomatoes at the screen. And we flip it on. That's not bad. We're looking at it. The skier looks like a skier.
Yeah.
There's perspective.
Yeah, but the logo at the bottom and the rainbow. It was just so impressive.
These guys aren't too bad. And we started playing it. We got addicted to skiing. So it really went from being an upstart to instantly.
It was
These guys are setting a bar.
It was instant credibility. Instant credibility.
Yeah. And once you work for a company that's setting a bar, you're not going to come in lower than that bar. And that was the main reason why we joined them. Because I knew if I went to Atari, I could do something in half the time and it would just be good enough and I'd make a lot of money. But that's not the way you enter an artistic career like that. You want to do the best.
It's certainly not the way you make a legacy.
Why don't you tell them about the Donkey Kong story?
The Donkey Kong story. When I was doing Donkey Kong, I was halfway through maybe. And the biggest problem with Donkey Kong and the Atari is that the screen has slanted ramps that the
girders
rolled in.
Yeah, the girders.
The girders are slanted. Well, the Atari can't do that. The Atari can only do one of two things. It can either have mirrored image on left and right of the screen. And think about it, you can't have slanted ramps with a mirrored image. They'd be like this, right? Or it does a reverse on one screen and the other, and you couldn't do that either. So there was no way to do unique graphics on the left side of the screen and unique graphics on the right side of the screen.
There was no way to do it with the hardware as Atari intended the hardware to be used.
Right. If you follow the rules, you couldn't do it. So when Tom Lopez from Atari came down, nobody from Coleco in the audience is there. I showed the game to Tom Lopez. If Coleco knew that, they would have killed me. But that's beside the point. I looked the other way when he looked at the screen. So I said, I'm going to put this up. I'll show it to you. And the game was beautiful. Barrel rolled down, ran, jumped over it, sound effect, the whole ball of wax. But everything was flat because that's the Atari. And I explained to him. I said, you can't do slanted. And I explained why. And we had a great talk. He said, I got to go catch a plane. He's walking out the door of my house. Right before the door closed, he looks back. He goes, by the way, if you worked at Activision, you'd figure out how to make those ramps be slanted like the arcade game.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
So 4 weeks later, they were slanted.
No, he's right. We would have done that.
So I said, well, hell or high water, I got to figure it out.
Yeah.
So I rewrote half my code and made the ramps slanted, which no one in the normal world understood at all was important or hard. But to people who programmed the Atari, it was, how'd you do that? But it was important that I did it to make it look like the arcade game.
We're talking about a period of time where a couple of dozen people in the world knew how to do this stuff. And it was unbelievably complicated. People are starting to get it now, and you see homebrew games coming out where people are starting to figure out how to do the stuff. But we still did tricks back then that are not being done today.
And if you want to know how hard the ramps are on Donkey Kong, there's a homebrew game of Donkey Kong now out that has all 4 levels. I couldn't do all 4 levels. I was in a 4K ROM.
Yeah.
Couldn't do all 4 levels. And this guy did all 4 levels, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful job. He used 8 times the memory I had, and he probably did it 10 times the time I had. And God bless the guy. And everybody says to me, did you see that guy did it 4 levels? His ramps aren't slanted. So he had all the time in the world. He had all the ROM in the world. And he just did this like 3, 4, 5 years ago. And everybody loves it. And it's flat ramps. So that's how hard slanted ramps are.
But
even he didn't do it.
Let's not forget the other...
Pat you on the back.
The other variable is that I think Garry had about 3.5 to 4 months to do this before
3 months.
Christmas of 1982. So, not only is this stuff hard, but we had real deadlines back then. And inevitably, when we would do a game, we would fit it in a 4K cartridge. Inevitably, when you were done with the game, it was 4.5K, maybe a little more, a little less. And then you had to take time to cut bytes so it could fit into the ROM. Because as David would tell you, the ROM was expensive back then. So you didn't think of adding ROM because that just took money off the top end and you'd touch your bottom line. But one thing...
You have no idea how difficult what he's talking about is. You're rewriting the code 5-10 times to save one byte.
To save one little byte to make it fit.
To save one byte.
But, we learned by putting on the skiing game initially that the Activision games just looked better.
And felt better and played.
They felt better. And we learned through working with Dave and his team that, there were sets of colors that they chose that worked really well on the screen. We never had flicker in our games like Pac-Man, which had all of the ghosts flicker on and off at different time intervals. None of our games flickered. We learned tricks through Dave. You were talking about sharing code.
Yes.
I remember Dave put in the Activision rainbow on the bottom display, and then he told us what code to use. And so we would share code like that and learn new tricks, and the guys on the West Coast would inevitably give us new techniques, and I think sometimes we would...
I have something to remember differently about sharing code. I remember joining the company, and we got a PDP-11, which is a big mini computer at that point, because that's what they had on the West Coast. So we were all using the same computer system, a networked PDP-11 to 6 or 7 terminals. And I remember, this is what I remember that there was kind of an intellectual wall between our office and their office, because those guys were so established and so important to the company. And, from our standpoint, we felt much less important than them, and that they were treated like gods in the organization. And I don't remember actually ever getting the code to their games. I don't remember.
No, actually, you're right.
It was
not
like
the
if
code.
somebody actually sent code of skiing over, I would have had a heart attack.
No, but I think Dave did share the rainbow code.
He did.
Because he had to put that in. That had to go into the bottom of our games.
I know you had the Pitfall source code, but anyway, but
on eBay.
Back up a little bit. To make this code work in the game, a finished game, has been rewritten so many times to be so specific to a specific type of game or whatever. The code was not reusable, really, in any way.
No.
Maybe, yes, the Activision logo at the bottom.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
not
specific.
at all.
Oh my goodness.
So specific.
So there were no shared blocks. There were no libraries. Oh, there were.
Well, think about horizontal strips. There's a horizontal strip at the top that has 6 digits of score. Dave created the 6-digit score kernel. Every video game company in the history of man since then has used it.
You talk about sharing code. I was walking through a mall in Sunnyvale, and I ran into the Magic guys. And, we were still friends, although it's,
different company.
all supposed to be really all secret and everything like that. And they came over and he said, God, that 6-digit score kernel, we took it out of Dragster, and we still don't know how it works.
So if you think about a horizontal line, you got the score kernel, you got the Activision logo. Those little pieces could be shared. But anything in the main part of the game screen, not a chance.
Now,
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
The hex code 60 in hex, is the opcode for a return from subroutine in the 6502 microprocessor. Okay? One of Bob Whitehead's tricks was he had a subroutine in code, and it ended with the RTS. All subroutines return with a return from subroutine opcode, right? He noticed that he had a table that started with 60 hex. So he put the two together and commented one of them out. And the routine fell through, and it used the 60 in the table, the data table, as its return from subroutine. And if he ever moved that code, the code would crash.
And anybody who's a PhD in computer science would have fallen over and died knowing that. Would have said, you people are idiots. What if you want to change that 60 someday? The code's going to crash. But that's the stuff you had to do to fit in 2K.
So you talk about kernels, and we're talking about a machine, 2600, that was never, as I understand it and know my history, was never meant to run anything other than Pong in combat.
That's right.
So how, and I'm going to ask because I just want to know, how do you get Pitfall and Keystone Capers and Crackpots out of something that was only supposed to run combat in Pong?
Well, I'll tell you, the interesting thing was silicon is expensive. as ROMs are expensive, silicon is expensive. And when they were making the Atari 2600, they were making the custom video chip. And it had all this capability. And it was too expensive. It was more than 200 mils on a side die size, which ran it up to where it was, 50% more expensive on the die or whatever. And so they went through a value engineering step, and they said, now wait a minute. The video chip is in every console that's already sitting on the shelf in Grandma's house. We can't change that once we sell it. But every time you plug in a new ROM, that changes. So they went through an engineering step where they said, what can we remove from the silicon that the task can be done by the code? And they removed a whole bunch of stuff. They removed how to position objects on the screen. The code has to do that now because the video chip can't. All sorts of things. So what that gave them is, serendipitous. Now, every time you change the ROM, you basically change the silicon because it's doing half of the job of the silicon chip. And that's why you have 6,000 different Atari 2600 games or whatever, over the life of its 10-year life, because the chip was not limited to, anyway, features were taken out of the chip so that they would be replaceable. So even before I left Atari, I was doing things on the screen, and I had the chip designer of the TIA chip standing behind me once. I kind of felt somebody behind me. I turned around. He was just shaking his head. And I said, "What's up, Jay?" And he said, "I didn't know my chip could do that."
Yeah. See, that blows my mind because it's so full of happy accidents, as Bob Ross would say.
Here's an example. Think about like Super Mario Brothers on the NES. If you have Mario, he's like 20 lines tall and he's drawn with a bunch of pixels. What you would do on the NES is you'd say, all right, that's sprite number 1, and you tell the NES video chip where Mario's bits are, and it'll take care of grabbing a bit and putting it on the screen. Next line, grab a bit, put it on the screen. Next line, grab a byte, put it on the screen.
So much more programmer friendly.
It would draw it. Yeah. Well, they said, fetching those graphics and putting them on every line sequentially, that's too hard for the chip. Let the software do it. So on every line of the screen, we had to reload every graphic for every character, grab it, and put it on the screen. No computer in the world has ever done that. And everybody has a bitmap now, and a bitmap is the entire screen. It points to an area of memory. You change the memory, the image on the screen changes. On the Atari, it had a bitmap. It was one line. The entire single scan line was the scan line. So you had to reload the bitmap every time. That took so many cycles of a 1 megahertz 6502 processor.
And on that one line, you only had 18 pixels you could change.
You can only change 18 pixels total. But the upside of that is where is Mario on the NES. If I said, there's Mario's 20 lines of them, go ahead and put them up, that's what it did. I didn't have the ability to say, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to shear Mario and shift them over on every line, or make them be double or triple size on every line. I didn't have that line-by-line control on the NES. He is what he is, right? Because it's hardware. But on the NES, you could take anything on any line and say, hey, now I'm going to make them 3 times the size.
On the 2600.
On the 2600, I mean. Yeah. I'm going to make them 3 times, or I'm going to make 3 copies of them on this line. And then on the next line, there's only going to be 1 copy. And by being able to do all those different crazy things, you could paint a world 1 line at a time any way you want it.
Yeah, and in as you mentioned, how do you get combat to turn into Keystone Capers?
Yes.
Well, as David said, as they removed from the silicon the ability to position the objects, they left it to the programmer. So in software, we have to position, the Mario once, or in Gary's case, the Keystone Cop once. But as the TV screen is painted as it goes down the screen, we can then say, hey, I want to reuse that guy and reposition him down here. And so in software, we can have that guy up here, which is player 0, be a cop. Down here, I can have it be a ball. Down here, I can have it be a little airplane. And so by taking things out of the chip and putting it into the control of the software cartridge, they actually made it made the ability for us to make games other than Tank and Pong. So David and his team learned, hey, I can reposition these things and change the graphics as the TV screen is painted going down, and I can change the background colors every line as it goes down. And thus they created in their games the beautiful Activision sunsets, and they could have multiple objects as the screen is painted down.
Now that all sounds like Nirvana, doesn't it? Well, the reality is, excuse my language, it was a bitch to do.
It was it still is.
Yes, you had all this power.
Yeah.
But good Lord, to figure it out and use it was like,
You counted every machine cycle down to the unit cycle, the single clock phase of the computer. And you had to know that I have to do this on clock phase 27 out of 72.
And if you missed by one and you had 73 cycles instead of 72, you could turn the screen on and it would just roll. You've lost the entire screen.
So what Garry had to do when he had, you had these 76 cycles across the screen from the beginning of the scan line, Garry had to count the machine cycles and knew when the raster in the back of the TV gun blew the burst of energy onto the phosphor screen, Garry knew I had to change every line of that tilt, and he had to know exactly where he was on the TV screen by counting the machine cycles that the processor was doing.
Now, who would ever choose to do this for a living?
And like it.
So,
Enjoy it.
And the question is, of course, there's no integrated development environments back then. So how did you guys do this? Graph paper? I mean, pen and paper?
Yes,
Yes, we did.
Dan actually made an incredible discovery just a month ago. He was clearing out an old offsite, and he found my old notebook from when I did this, and there's pages and pages of hand drawing on graph paper of all the Mario frames of Donkey Kong and all the piece of paper, and an entire
how
layout
Garry did
of
the tilting,
slanted
Colored squares on graph paper.
little pencil squares on graph paper.
That's
Is
the
how
way
we
you
did
did it.
all our art.
And you became really good at looking at 8 squares that were some were colored and some weren't, and instantly translating it in your head to hexadecimal number.
Because you had to then type it in.
So I'd look at this graph paper and go
C4,
A5,
C4,
22, 28. Well, and that's what you did.
Right. So instead of art, the graphics for every scan line are simply code numbers.
Yeah.
So we had to make the Mario by making code numbers turn into those little bits, and that's how you created the Keystone Keeper or
But
the
it was
Mario.
so fun to do.
But it was so fun, and that's
was
why
like a
we still
puzzle.
do it today,
Yeah.
actually.
If nothing else, it was rewarding when it finally came together.
And even today, which we'll talk about on Sunday,
Yeah.
when we did a game we just finished, Circus Convoy, I mean, I would spend 6, 7, 8, 9 hours doing one object. And then I would send it to Dave, and I'd call him up and go, what do you think? He goes, it's all right. I mean, I'm not sure it's a snake. And then I go back and I'd massage it. And but you love every minute of it because you know that it's so damn hard to do, but it's fun.
I will say this, the name that you all created for yourselves in Activision, it stands on its own 40 years later.
Well, we appreciate that.
It really does. And for folks like myself, and I'm sure for everybody here in the audience, you're here for a reason. It's probably because you love the Activision games. You love the Atari 2600. What you all have gifted to us collectively can't be matched. It really cannot be matched. And we thank you for that. I'm looking forward to talking about Absolute and especially about Audacity as well, because that's the reinvigoration of Activision of old, at least in my mind. Okay, that's how I see it. So I get to be a kid again, is what I get to be, and that's awesome. And it really is. Thanks to you all. I will say this: this has been the fastest hour that I've had the pleasure of sitting through in most recent memory. And I know that we're already running a bit over, but you all have invested your time as well. Do you all have any questions that you'd like to ask either Garry or David or Dan? Because I know we're a bit over, but I don't want anybody to lose this opportunity.
That guy in the back, have you ever played video games before?
We do have a ringer in the back. I'm going to tell everybody.
That's Shilly Mitchell.
Well, I know a little bit of the history, you guys, and I won't expound on it, we'll be here another hour. But to turn into a humorous point from some of what you told me, I wanted you to expand on your experience. Dan, you told me that you guys are on the East Coast, okay, in the late 70s, the early 80s, back and forth communications. You're basically flirting with the idea of going to different companies, and they're very interested in what you're doing because your work's incredible. And you told me at lunch how literally panic, for lack of a better term, came over you because suddenly it was, I don't know what company, but this guy's coming to see us. He's the big boss. He wants to see our offices. He wants to see our operation, our laboratory, everything. Yeah. What you were bringing him to was a desk in a cold basement with one light that you guys work on.
Billy's talking about, yeah, when we were in Gary's basement, and Gary had that call with Tom Lopez.
Yes,
he said, "I want to come out and see your facilities." And I looked and said, "Do you want to see our bathroom?" I mean,
and talking about?
We were in a cold basement, not even a finished basement.
An unfinished basement.
And the next week, or Tom Lopez and Jim Levy, who work and head up a $250 million company, come to this little house in New Jersey, and they come downstairs into the cold basement with the desk and all the electronics, and had a great time. And in the middle of the meeting, we're sitting at the desk, and there's a knock on the door, and I go upstairs and come down and say, "Gary, it's PSE&G. They need to read the meter."
The water meter.
The water meter was behind the desk.
Behind all the 2,600 equipment.
So Tom Lopez, president of a $250 million company, our vice president, and Jim Levy helped us move the big wooden desk so that PSE&G could read the meter, and then we could continue the negotiations of us joining Activision.
I forgot that story. That's a good story.
Yes. So thank you.
When you tell me a story, it never gets forgotten.
That's a good story. Thank you for bringing that to
Let
us.
me pick on Dave for a minute. You told me, you said, testing, writing code. It was over and over. I mean, it would be a dozen or even 24 times. You said you would show a game at a show, and really you're showing the game, but you're still in the testing mode. There were times where you showed the game at a show, and you still had to go back and write the code.
I know what game he's talking about.
Yeah. I think I know as well.
That will come up in the absolute story because it's a boy in his blob.
Yeah, boy in his blob.
But then what happened was, even to the point, I said, tell me your worst case scenario. You had a game that was out on the market.
Oh, yes.
Those games back.
That's a good story.
Yeah. What game was that?
That was Decathlon.
Oh, yes.
Decathlon.
Yes.
All right, I'll tell that story.
That's a good story.
But the games at the show, although they were great, they were never 100% the final piece that the public got.
Sometimes you tried.
It depended on what the release date was. We had this horrible release schedule. We had to release, there was 10 weeks of manufacturing, and the games had to be on the stores by Thanksgiving when people started doing their Christmas sales. So we were finishing games in the middle of June and couldn't go beyond that because it had to turn into a ROM. These days, you rewrite the code and you download a patch tomorrow. We had literally half a year that we had to finish. So they really, CES in June, they were very close to being done, but occasionally that would happen. The story they're talking about is the Make-A-Wish Foundation had a young man who had a terminal illness, and they asked him what his wish was, and his wish was, I want to visit Activision. I want to go into the lab and get to see secret stuff that nobody ever has seen yet.
Wow.
Right? And so he came, and they had the big film crew or whatever. And
that's pretty powerful.
And so for him, we said, you're going to be the first person outside of Activision to play the Activision Decathlon, which was just getting ready to be released. And showed him how to play it, and he was playing the pole vault at the time. And anyways, cameras and lights, and they're asking him questions, and he's playing a game, and he's running down and about to plant his pole for the pole vault, and one of the women asks him a question. He looks up, and so he presses the joystick button, knows he has to do that to plant the thing, and while she's asking him a question, he keeps pushing the button.
Like he's still running.
Yeah. And so I'm sitting there watching with a camera on my face as well, as the guy with each press of the button goes higher and higher and higher and higher, and eventually off the screen.
Off the screen.
Oh, wow.
That's not supposed to happen.
I released that code the day before. So we continued our little discussion, and then let's take a break. I said, yeah, let's take a break. And I ran over to manufacturing, and I said, stop the presses. Okay, I have a bug I have to fix. And
Wow.
so, yeah, there was a camera on me while that was happening, and I don't know what my face looked like, but I know what my stomach looked like.
That is hysterical.
And back then, if you didn't find a bug, but it came out in the finished game, it was immediately called a feature.
Yes.
There was. We couldn't change the ROM.
Yeah. Well, I think you had a question, didn't you, sir?
Yeah, you never really got to. How did you exchange data? FedEx wasn't really around.
Yeah. Well, there was no
Oh, I'll tell you two stories.
I
You're
could
right.
get the FedEx
FedEx
faster
wasn't
than
around.
anyone on the East Coast.
If you had to get something to a client, this was before FedEx. You know, Fred Smith was ridiculed when he put that in as a idea in Harvard to do this overnight service. They said, oh, you guys see on the project, because they said that's ridiculous. Nobody wants it. We had cases, especially pre-video game. I think we were doing something for Parker Brothers for one of the toys. We needed to get them something tomorrow. You know how you did that? You packaged it up, you got in your car, you drove to the airport.
Yep.
You put it in luggage.
Delta Dash.
And you called Delta Dash was one of the versions. And you literally put it in luggage, called them up, gave them the claim ticket. They went, when the plane came in, they went to baggage and they got the package.
Yeah.
That's what you did for FedEx.
It cost the price of the plane.
Well, no.
It was cargo.
It was sub a price of a plane ticket, but still a few $100s. The other thing we did was the game that we were talking about with the 10 weeks, have to make Christmas. The game had to be at Nintendo in Seattle, Washington, actually Redmond, on May 30th. Now that was, I guess, Memorial Day, right? Or within a day of Memorial Day. But anyway, it had to be there May 30th. It's there June 1st. We don't manufacture for Christmas. Sorry.
Literally,
May 30th.
if you're one day late,
So
you
May
can't get the game.
27th, May 28th, we've still got bugs, right? And there's no FedEx. So what we did was we took a guy, an engineer, and we packed up an entire NES development system and a PC.
And an EEPROM program.
And an EEPROM programmer and blank EEPROMs, and we flew him to Redmond, Washington, and he set up a lab across the street from Nintendo. At 11 in the morning on May 30th, we sent him the code over a
modem.
Yeah.
what was it, 2400 baud?
Yeah, 2400
It
baud
was
modem.
probably 1200 at that.
1200
baud modem.
One byte at a time, and he sat there for hours receiving this. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now he has the code. He burns ROMs, puts them into a cartridge, walks into Nintendo at 1 minute to 5 and says, I have a delivery for you. Here's a game that has to make Christmas. And we actually did that on the day to get that there, or else we wouldn't have made it.
However, in other cases, when FedEx did exist, we knew exactly where to go to FedEx. We knew the exact time at 9 p.m. we had to get the package there. And we would sometimes be at our office, which was 15 minutes away, and leave at 10 to 9 and still get there. How we did it, I do not know.
We knew where every FedEx
When it
depot
absolutely
was.
positively had to
We
be
knew
there
people
tomorrow,
that worked there.
we got it there somehow
You could drive around to the back
and drop
and
it off.
go in through where they loaded the
And then you
trucks,
learned,
get
hey, if I
them
drove to the airport before the FedEx plane leaves, I can jump there and get it to them because I have another half hour. And on many of
what
our
an
games, we have to
industry.
do that.
Yeah.
What an industry.
Any other questions? Yeah. Yes.
I mean, so obviously Activision has a reputation for being better games, like collectively, percentage-wise versus everything else that was going on Atari at the time. But how do you think you guys define fun in a way that, like, you knew if it was good before anyone in the public ever got to touch it?
Well, you know, if you could define what fun is, you could make $1 million. I mean, we don't know until you play it. But we had this group synergy, and so we would literally, there would be people playing it. As it got near the end, everybody was playing it. We'd take time away from our own games and we'd play it. And, you know, this sucks. I'm sorry, it's not going to go out this way. And we had, you know, 150 collective years of gameplay experience in that lab. and everybody had to like it before it would go out. So we were our own target market. If we liked the game, the millions of people were going to like it. We just happened to have the
And that's really the only way you could do it, right? Yeah. I mean, one of the fascinating things about that is something I've always said. They say, what's it like testing your own game? And for me, I came to the conclusion that I could tell when a game was actually going to be good and go out. Because think about how you make a game. You make a game, put a guy on the screen, write code to make him go left and right. Stop for a second, run the game. Yep, he goes left and right. Move on to the next task. Put a background up. Yep, the background's up. So you go through all these tasks and you test. Make a test. Make another test. Write some code. Make another test. Well, there's some point in time where you're beyond the mundane bricks that make the environment and you're getting down to interactivity. And I would change something and test. Okay, that worked. Change something, that worked. Change something, that worked. At some magic moment, you would change something and you would test beyond the point of did that work? Like you would actually start to test and play a little bit.
Well, we did.
And when you found yourself testing longer than you had to, you knew that you had found the spark of genius. You found something that I'm playing because I want to play, not because I'm checking to see if that piece of code worked. And that's where you knew you had it.
Yeah,
if you never reached that point, don't put the game out.
At Activision, we would walk over, and if I played it and said, I want to try that again. And
that was the moment.
And we learned as being programmers, you could take two games and give them to a player, and they'd play them, and they would say, I like that one better than that one, but I don't know why. And we learned as coders, it was the little details we put in. So when the guy was running and you went back the other way, maybe he slid a little bit before he just instantly changed directions.
Just a little bit
and
of physics
put in those
goes a long
details
way.
of simulating physics. And it made the guy feel better. He ran smoother. Yeah. And so all those things in every element help make the intangible fun get into the game.
How often would you abandon something like either entirely though? Because like if you get so far into it, and you're like, I know this can work, but it doesn't work yet.
Yeah, I abandoned several games. I had a off-road dirt bike game, and the problem was the Atari. I used all the capability of the Atari just to make the dirt bike, and I couldn't find any way to do anything that was challenging with it. I'd just drive it around for a while.
Yeah. A hell of a good demo, though. Independent suspension on the front and back wheels.
Oh, wow.
It was beautiful.
It was just no fun.
Wasn't a game.
Office people, or did sometimes your family of the office people interact? And going further, did some of the people in the office have kids? Because that would be an indication.
I mean, that was later. That wasn't in the Atari days. Yeah. Later, as you started to get the more complex games, I would bring them home. And a lot of people don't know this, but I have triplets. So when my triplets were young, 2 boys and a girl, they're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, or even high school, I would bring stuff home and, let them go hog wild on it and find out. One of the amazing things is, as much as people in the industry have an ego, I'm the best, I know everything, I know how great a game is. You can't let the ego get in the way when you give it to somebody to play and they come back and go, I hate this freaking game. And you're like, no, I've played that game 1,000,000 times and it's fun as hell. And they go, no, I hate the game. And the problem is you're playing it the way you meant it to be played, and you're playing it in a way that's obvious to you. But when you give it to them and they haven't seen you play it, they are going to do something logical to them. And you're like, well, didn't you like when you jumped over that thing and you caught that other thing? And they go, I couldn't do it. I tried it 100 times. You got to know that that's valid, and you got to watch and figure out what was obvious to you that sucked for them. And if you had a guy who was so egomaniac that he wouldn't do that, you're not going to have a good game.
By that time, you also played the game for 1,000 hours, so you can do that jump really well because you've been doing it for 6 months straight, and you didn't realize that if somebody just picked it up,
you have to see how a
not
newbie
that good.
does.
It's hard to do.
Got to see how somebody who's never seen the game, how they react to it.
Since we're blowing through our hour, I'll tell 2 other stories having to do with Pitfall, since it's one of the best-known games.
I never played it. Is it any good?
Yeah.
By one of the best-known designers.
A week before Pitfall was ready to release, there was only one life. And I was being the purist. I was being the genius, asshole genius. And I said, look, it's a pure game. You play with one life, and when you die, you start over. That's all. And because we had this group synergy, we had all these other people standing behind me and said, no, that's not going to happen. And they sat on me and made me put in 3 lives with the guy who falls out of the sky and the little, the ROM was already full. I had to find more bytes to do that, of course. But it was almost going to go out as one life because I was a purist, and it would have never survived the market. It wouldn't have become the.
Oh, there would have been so many broken TVs.
But also because Pitfall is a big deal in the origin of this industry. The other thing that I did in Pitfall is one of those things that Dan just mentioned that you don't even notice it. I mean, we did so many things in our games that the average player felt like, boy, this is better than Atari's games, but I can't tell why. And one very specific example in Pitfall is when you're standing on the head of an alligator and you're trying to jump to the head of the next alligator, you have to press the button to jump and press the stick to the right in order to jump diagonally. If you press the button and a 60th of a second later you move the stick, he's going to jump straight up. If you move the stick and a 60th of a second press the button, he's going to run and fall into the water. So the way it was originally written, in 1/60th of a second, which was our frame rate, you had to do both of those buttons. And that was very difficult. That was very exacting. And it didn't work. So what I did
Well, it worked for really good players.
Yeah.
You learned it and said, man, I'm good. I can do that jump.
So what I did was, when you jumped, for 3/60ths of a second, I continued to read the joystick so that you could, if you hit them both at the same time, or you think you hit them both at the same time, as long as you hit the button first, which was actually a shorter throw. So if you did them at the same time, the button would make first. And then for 3/60ths of a second, it would read the joystick to the right. And so you could jump it felt so much better. You can jump over from alligator to alligator. Now, I got people tell me 40 years later that it was the hardest game they ever played. And I said, oh, come on, But
Don't you know what I did?
I gave you 3/60ths of a second. Yeah.
But that's a huge thing. It's this tiny little thing of reading the stick at a particular time so that it plays more easily, so that
forgiving.
It's more
little
friendly,
more forgiving.
A little more friendly.
Yep.
And again, that game probably wouldn't have been the huge success that it was and spawned hundreds and hundreds of platform game imitators, except for a couple of those little things that we did that nobody could see.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So notoriously, Grand Theft Auto started out as there was a bug in the game where the other car would chase you down and crash you, and that then changed the game into, well, those are the cops. And was there any glitch or bug that created new gameplay?
Yeah, well, but that's an absolute error.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
See, we know every.
Yeah. So
we're one brain.
Yeah.
I don't even,
Yeah. So one thing I will say is tomorrow at 4:00 we're going to spend another hour with Gary and David and Dan, and we're going to talk about the absolute era. In the games that came out, A Boy and His Blob, and there's a list of others, and we're going to talk about essentially, just kind of preview this, the demise of Activision as we all loved it, and then rolling into the absolute era. So if that's that, then then come out tomorrow and we'll talk through that.
One? That's the only one I could think of. There was clearly a bug that turned into a great feature.
Nothing comes to mind, but yes, it did happen.
It does happen on rare occasions.
Larry Kaplan wanted to put a video camera, stop motion video camera on his screen for an entire development and then turn it into a movie. Because there are times you'd write code and the screen would just be garbage. You do one thing wrong and the Atari 2600 would completely screw up and destroy it.
Yeah.
Well, I have one quick example.
Okay.
One quick example. It's almost what you're saying. In our later years, we were doing iPhone games, and I was doing an air hockey game, and you played against the computer. So it's perspective view of an air hockey thing, and you move the puck and hit, and in the back, the computer is very smart and is playing against you. And hardest part of writing something like that is the artificial intelligence of the guy in the back to feel like a player when he's playing against you.
Not too easy, not too
Not
hard.
like a robot,
challenging,
but almost has a brain. So I was like, oh, God, I got to write that. It's going to be really hard. So first thing I do when I'm going to write something like that is I just write something very basic. I say, all right, I'm just going to write something basic to make sure that he moves to where the puck is going to be, and he's there ready to hit it. Well, it was only about 30 lines of code. And I obviously had a bug in it. Because I hit the puck to him, and he slides over, grabs the puck, moves around holding it, and then shoots at me and scores. And I said, what the hell was that? And I left it alone. And that was the final AI. And I never really know what that code did. But it wasn't what I intended. But man, did it play well. I left it alone.
Yeah.
So bizarre.
Any other questions? Oh, we've got a couple. Yes, sir. Yeah. So Dwight from The Office. Yes.
Dwight from The
I'm going to tell you, Dwight. That is some strong mustard right there.
Black bear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Identity theft is not a joke.
I'm always looking for like overlooked gems from that era. Is there any game that y'all worked on that like didn't find the audience that you think it should have had?
Well, yeah. I mean, I did Canyon Bomber, and Canyon Bomber also had the game Depth Charge in it. These were two of Atari's pretty successful arcade games, and I put both of them into a 2K game. And it did not do it very well. I don't know if it was not marketed very well, but the development of that has a couple interesting stories, since I'm just going to skip the dinner tonight, I think.
The dinner.
Yeah, we are.
Forgot the dinner.
I forgot the dinner too.
I'm not hungry. A couple stories from Canyon Bomber. One was, I don't know if you even remember this arcade game. I don't know if they have one out there, but two airplanes dropping bombs, and the bombs go down and they knock out these balls that are worth points. And if you undercut one, the ones that are above have to keep falling down and filling the holes. There's a little bit of this gravity calculation. And I was right out of college, and I knew gravity was 16, times
32 feet per second
squared.
Per second.
And I sat down with a piece of paper, and I said, I'm going to figure out gravity and all this. And I was working on a 6502 microprocessor that ran at 1 megahertz. And it's after pages and pages of scribbling, I ended up turning it into 2 lines of assembly language, which was basically...
So you're saying gravity in 2 lines of code.
Exactly.
You fake it is what you do.
Yeah.
Basically, it did an and, an or, and an exclusive or. So it was really 3 lines. And it took the pixel from this row and put it into that row, leaving them blank behind by just masking. And then I put it in a loop, and they looked like they fell.
Yeah.
So at the time when we were making Atari games, you had to have game options. Do you remember the game options? I mean,
oh, yes.
Atari had some stupid ones that had 1,024 game options.
Yeah, Space Invader had 112. I'm using 112, but that many different ways.
So I put in eight options or whatever, and one of the options was to turn off that gravity. So it changed the game. So when you bomb dropped and it undercut some, they stayed in the same place, and you had to come at them from a slightly later trajectory to hit them instead of shooting the same shot, which because they've now fallen down, you would hit them, right? And they sent the gals over from the marketing department who were going to be writing the manual, and I'm showing them how Canyon Bomber works, and I'm going through all this, and I said, then there's these game options, and I went to the game option, and I dropped a bomb, and it went down there, and it took out several, and the ones didn't fall. And these girls gasped and said, how did you make them stay up like that? Now, you got to remember that for it to fall, I had to tell it to fall. I had to write code to make it fall. And if I skipped that code, it would stay up like that.
But they believed it was real gravity.
So I knew that I'd made the suspension of disbelief where they thought this was the real world. When we start with a blank screen, a ball doesn't bounce. unless we tell it to bounce. A ball doesn't fall unless we tell it to fall. Nothing moves unless we tell it to move.
It means we're all megalomaniacs, basically.
We're God. We are God, and we're making a world, right?
Oh, that's fun.
But, so they really thought that they should fall because they fall in the real world.
It's a miracle.
It was a miracle.
It's a miracle.
And what was the other Canyon Bomber story that...
I don't know. That's the only Canyon Bomber.
Well, no, actually, that was two stories. It was one was the creating the gravity.
Yeah.
Turned out to be nothing but that I'd learned in physics in college and everything. It was an and, an or, an exclusive or in a loop.
Well, in answer to your question about a game that never had its due, I think the classic example is a game that was done in my office, wasn't done by me, but Hero. I mean, Hero is a game that no one ever talked about Hero until years later. And now most people say it's the best game ever on the platform.
Yeah,
well,
it's a shining star.
It's on everyone's top 10.
Yes.
You look at everyone's top 10
But
list.
it came out so late that I don't know how few it sold.
It was definitely overlooked. There's
It was John Van Ryzen.
Yeah.
Worked in our office. I went to high school. I went to college with John Van Ryzen in engineering. And, we all had a lot, Dan and I had a lot to do with it. We play tested the hell out of it. It was amazing how deep it was. We really thought it was an incredible game. But it came out at the same time Pressure Cooker came out. It's another game that I really liked that never got its due. But really, at the top of that list has to be Hero. Because no one ever knew that game. 10 years after the Atari was gone, no one knew that game existed. But with emulation, suddenly it's like, Hero. Wow. Yeah. I never saw that game.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most valuable games to buy.
Amazing.
Yes,
and the patch.
Yeah.
You ever look at the Hero patch?
Yeah.
It's like $500 on eBay.
Yeah, it is.
You got a Hero patch. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
With all the different games you created, and now I've learned that there were different variations and things that were different with Atari 2600. Did any of those variations in the Atari 2600 cause or aggravate any of the games you created? In other words, the hardware version.
The old version, the changes to the hardware.
We were pretty careful to use, there are a lot of techniques that you can use that we chose not to use because we knew that the original chip wasn't supposed to work that way. So it didn't happen to us a lot at Activision because we were very careful about that.
Yeah. We did funky stuff, but we did it within the rules.
Yeah.
So just real quick, you mentioned the patches.
Yes.
That's something that I've always been curious about. Who had that idea and who created it? Was that just purely a marketing-driven motion right there within Activision?
It was brilliant.
It was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Probably Jim Levy?
Yeah, I mentioned that when we got connected to Jim Levy, he was a business guy, but he had worked for the record business, and so he knew how to promote products. And, they accused us of being treated like rock stars, and it's not exactly right. We're more like authors of books.
Yeah.
Because he came from the record business, they talked about that.
Yeah.
And his marketing was genius. And
he was absolutely brilliant.
Yes.
And he came up with the idea for the patches. We had a big fight with him on the game boxes themselves. That's another question. One of the things that I hated about the guys who wrote the manuals for Atari is get yourself Atari's breakout game.
Yeah, and read the thing.
Open up the manual.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure it starts with, you're flying through space.
It does. It absolutely does.
And you encounter a multicolored force field. Now, come on. We know what breakout is. It's a ball that's hitting against bricks, right?
Yeah.
So, and then you look at the cover art, and there's some really nice cover art, but it belongs, in a Frazetta painting, not in a video game. Because you look at it, you can't tell what the game is about.
Right.
So we went to Levy and programmers and developers, and we went there and we said, look, the game has to show the game screen right on the cover. We're not going to mislead people and all this. And he was looking at all this other stuff and said, yeah, but look at all this real cool art that you can put on here. And he said, how about every game will have the game screens on the back so that anybody who's really curious will turn around and see the actual game screen.
Yeah.
And on the front, we'll just do something that is an artist representation. You know, they throw in the colored rainbow to show
swoosh.
motion, and all
Yeah.
this kind of stuff. So we ended up with a compromise, but we insisted that you could, if you picked up this box at the store, you could see what the game was going to be like. You would not be fooled.
Yeah.
But
Anyway.
Levy made so many brilliant marketing decisions
Yeah.
that people, it's all about the designers. It's all about the great games.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have had the same level of success without him.
Yeah. Well, I will say collectively, you did it right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
three days before CES, when we were going to show Freeway, it was a man running across the screen. And we're in a meeting, and he said, hey, why don't you make it a chicken? We'll tell the story about why the chicken crossed the road, and we will hire the San Diego chicken to come to CES and advertise our games. The San Diego chicken started out as the KGB chicken and did Padres games and such, and he was a big deal in LA, right? So, great. I went and I actually liked the chicken graphic much better than the man graphic that I had, so I was happy to do that. Made that change in a day and a half. And he calls the San Diego chicken. San Diego chicken wants $5,000 for the performance or for one day's appearance and 2 suites at the Desert Inn Hotel, right? And our marketing guy says, I can rent a chicken suit.
Yeah, but the best part of that, it's one of 2 suites because it was one for the chicken and one for the chicken assistant.
Chicken assistant.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we had our marketing guy whose
Probably.
name, I swear to God, PR guy, right?
Yeah.
His name is Fred Hypes.
That's a good name.
Now that is a solid name.
That was his given name for PR.
The original hype man. Yes. Yeah.
And he wore a chicken suit. Now, of course, Fred had the reputation of he couldn't go to lunch without destroying his tie with food. So we had a cleaning bill on the chicken suit. But it didn't come up to $5,000, so it was good.
We still had the version in the back lab of the little guy. And when he got hit by the car, there was a little red splat on the
Oh my gosh.
Called Splat.
Splat. Oh, wow.
But that never made it out.
No, that was just
awesome.
a joke version.
Yes, just a joke. So what happened in the real game if you actually were a little guy that you just moved him back down?
Same thing, right?
No, it's difficulty switch. If you were in the low difficulty, you get knocked back a couple rows. If you were in the high difficulty, you get knocked back to the beginning.
Okay.
So you could still handicap one player against
So
the
he
other.
didn't get run over in the car.
What a lot of people don't know about the Atari 2600 is it's got these extra switches, which they eventually moved and almost made them invisible. And they were called the difficulty switches. They have a position A and a position B. Now, whenever we wrote a game, we had to give a different version for A and B difficulty for each of the player in a 2-player game. So, it would have a different skill level. And the reason that was done on the Atari 2600 back in 1977 is because Dad, who played sports as a kid and had better hand-eye coordination than his kid, could be handicapped when playing his kid in a 2-player head-to-head game.
Interesting.
And they had it backwards.
It did not take long before you had to handicap the kid in order to play with Dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Any other questions before we wrap?
Do you guys have like a book on like all these stories?
Working on it.
We're working on it, yeah.
We're working on it. Give us a year.
A year, okay.
Give us a year.
Fantastic. That's awesome. Great question. Great.
And also, what time on Sunday is?
11:30. So it's 4:00 tomorrow for the absolute years, and then it's 11:30 on Sunday morning for Audacity Games.
So is tomorrow going to be recorded? I'm going to be.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
And Sunday will be recorded as well. Yeah. And we'll let you know where you can find it and everything like that. So excellent. Yeah, a couple more questions here, then we'll wrap up. Yes.
I was just, you guys' booth was right next to John Pomeroy, and I was just thinking about the parallels between you're leaving Atari and starting Activision, and like Don Bluth and John and Gary leaving Disney and starting with Bluth films and video games. You guys ever made that conversationally or anything like that?
Not really. I mean, when I think about leaving Disney, I think more about the Pixar guys. because he had started as an animator. It was always his dream. But no, I didn't know the whole Bluth story.
Yeah, and Activision was a story where Atari did not appreciate creative people. And in the movie business, the Disney and Bluth, his reasoning would have certainly been different for us. But we said, come on, guys. I mean, we did $60 million worth of sales for you last year. We obviously know what we're doing. We're good at this. We want some financial recognition and personal recognition. And they said, no. Games are done by nameless guys back in the lab. And we said, we are going to leave Atari and we're going to found a company. And one of the founding principles is that the game designer gets credit for his work the same way a book author would get it. So that was a creative difference thing, really. And I don't know what the Bluth story was.
Well, there was a creative slump at Walt Disney at that point, but yeah.
We've worked with Disney many times in the past, and every lowly employee thinks they're Walt Disney. I mean,
that's the biggest problem with the organization.
Terrible to work with. Horrible to work
23-year-old assistant licensing person comes in and starts telling you how to make a game because they think they're Walt.
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, enough.
So the fact that they left them, we understand that part.
Yeah. Nobody from Disney in the room, is there?
No.
All right, one more question.
Go ahead.
So you were adamant on Pitfall having just one life. Do you feel somewhat justified in holding that position, seeing modern indie games embracing roguelike mechanics?
No, I mean, the indie movement is actually good for the video game business. If for no other reason than the budgets are so high that nobody can do anything original or creative unless you do it through the indie, business. There was the movie The Players, starring
Tim Robbins.
Tim Robbins.
Great movie.
And, they do these pitches at the movie studios, and the way they try to get something sold is this, well, it's Driving Miss Daisy meets The Terminator, or Die Hard, right? And
wow.
they use that kind of, and so if you're going to try to go into a company and say, I want you to spend $100 million making a game, and it's going to be about butterflies, all right, that's not going to happen. It has to be, well, it's just like Call of Duty, but we're setting it in medieval times, and there's something really special can happen if you pick up this magic wand, whatever. You have to pitch it as Call of Duty just to get in the door, and then you get to work on it a little bit. And if it doesn't turn into something, very saleable very quickly, they cut off the tap, and you don't get developed. So, the indie developers can do all sorts of really cool things, and you may like it, you may not like it, but at least it's good for the business. Otherwise, every game would be the same.
And actually, that reminds me of one last story I meant to tell that's about that. And it's similar to Dave's story about the quality of games and success. At one point, we brought investors into one of our later companies, Skyworks. And these were a couple of people who, Yale, Princeton, top of the world, MBAs, know everything. And I was doing a pitch meeting with them, and I was explaining the video game industry to them. And I basically said, no one can predict hits, and if you do 10 games, maybe 3 of them are going to make money, 7 of them are going to fail, may not even come out, may fail, whatever, you lost the developments. And on the 3, 1 of them may be a giant hit, and 2 of them will make their money back plus a little bit. I said, that's the way the industry works. I mean, that's pretty much it. Not that different than the film industry, whatever. And the Princeton guy, who was just a little extra sharper than everybody else in the room, said, well, I have a question. And I said, yeah. He said, why don't you just do the 2 that make all the money? That was a real question.
Did that sound anything like the marketing memo we got at Atari?
Similar to
make the 2 that make all the money.
Similar to.
And I said, and not do the other 7 or 8. He said, yeah.
Similar to.
Meeting over.
Similar to my partner, my wife's mother-in-law, who's 96, who knows what I do, says, he makes video games. Why can't he just make Angry Birds?
Yeah.
She's a pianist. Why can't you just write another Mozart piece? It just doesn't work that way. Why don't you just make the ones that sell really well?
Although we were in a meeting with someone in our company who said, why don't we just make our own moose and squirrel?
We were licensing the Rocky and Bullwinkle show.
We have a lot of stories.
And it was X amount of money, and our lawyer who was in the said, why don't we just, well, actually, we were licensing Goofy from Disney, which is an extreme amount of money, and he said, why don't we just make our own dog?
Yeah.
Wow. I think Moose
so
and
some
Squirrel
people
was
get it, and some people don't.
That's true. Yeah.
That's life.
It is.
Anybody ever walks into a design meeting and they have a suit on, just run the other way.
Okay.
All
All right, thank you guys.
So, yeah,
The time.
yeah, thank you all for the
Thank you,
time.
everyone.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.